on Wednesdays from 5 to 9. This library has set aside these computers so you can solely focus on applying for jobs.
Right.
We're also doing that for the online response.
Okay.
Which is great. So we're looking towards 2020, we want to work with libraries, community colleges, any organization, any trusted organization, and especially if you look at those areas, and you're going to hear from Stephen in a little bit, a great tool he has, those areas that we deem are the hardest to enumerate, where we're going to have trouble making sure everyone gets counted. We need to find the partners in those areas, and do they have, who are the trusted voices, who are the partners that those community members go to when they need something, or when they're looking for guidance, and do they have those resources available?
Right.
And if not, is there a way to get them those resources available?
That's great. And what about, you had mentioned it briefly, but how do you feel like the messaging for 2020 will be different? At what point does the Census Bureau begin to talk about a media strategy, ethnic media strategy? How does that work?
So we will have a national media campaign, and that contract has been awarded. And that I don't have too much information about that yet. That's in the works. But I think more important to the state of New York will be the local partnership program and the local media campaign that we do.
And who controls that? Your office controls that?
Yeah, we'll be controlling the partnership program and, of course, working with our partners. I mean, it's not just us making decisions. So how I see this has to work to be effective is we need to engage with partners as yourself, understand the communities that we feel are going to be hard to count, make sure that the latest data makes sense. Neighborhoods, city blocks change from one year to the next dramatically. So that's why understanding from that local partner, what is the current situation on the ground? And then with that partner, what is the best message? For some people, it's, hey, the census is your civic duty. For others, it's about power, it's about congressional representation.
Right.
For others, and for the majority, I would say it's about the $675 billion of federal funding that's disseminated. So when you look at roads in your area, or emergency management services, or schools, that's what the census is about. So we want to work with those partners, tell us what is the best message, and then work together, what is the best vehicle to get that message to the community? Is it a PSA from a local community leader on a in-language radio station in the area? Is it a newspaper? Is it an event that we have? Is it a church service? That's what we need to learn. So I see us as providing a toolkit, working with our partners to determine what of that toolkit works, change it to make it work for that particular community, and then work together to determine, again, the vehicle for getting that message out.
So say a little bit more about the partnership program itself, and how, I don't know if in the past you've worked with foundations, what, going forward, like how do we become a partner? How do we help the groups that we are supporting become partners in some formal kind of way?
Sure. So I don't think we're going to have any, real specific, like formal contracts to sign or anything like that. I think
we should just come to your office and say, we're here.
You have my on the last slide, my email address. I hope that you use it. You have a direct line to me at any point in time. And, of course, as the census gets a little bit busier, I get a little bit busier. But I will have a partnership staff. And right now I have 9 partnership specialists on board. I'm just getting ready to post for an additional 10, for a total of 19 for this fiscal year. Next fiscal year, we're looking at over 100 additional partnership specialists. So another thing that I reach out to partners for instance, we're opening an office in Albany, one of our Wave 1 offices. We'll also be opening 2 offices here in New York City, what we call our Wave 1 or early offices. These offices will open in January of 2019.
Great.
And one thing we do for our partners, and when we get ready to post those job announcements, we want to send them first to all our partners, and then let our partners send them out to their community members. The most important thing, even though a census is a national event, in order to be successful, it has to be conducted at the local level.
Yeah.
And in order to be conducted at the local level, we need to hire people who work in those communities, who understand those communities. Not just the people knocking on the doors, but the managers that are running that office, the supervisors we need in that office to help support the managers, and all the clerical staff. So that's another ask that I have of all our partners. So in looking forward, you know, I have your contact information now, and I got the list prior to the meeting, so I know who you are and you know who I am. I hope we continue this, and
Yeah.
we need to know who are those partners we need to reach out to. You know, right now is really an education phase, but starting in September, we're going to start recruiting for 2020.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, you know this, I think, but on the call this morning, each entity that we represent, each foundation supports local community groups in different parts of the state. And so I think each of us will be a helpful conduit for you to get to some of those local groups. I want to just take a minute to see, I have more questions, but are there questions either folks on the phone have or people in the room have for Jeff? Yes, Maria.
Talk a little bit more about how it'll be determined to get the paper form versus not, because I know that some people will get paper form off the bat, and I thought it was we were in the harder to count areas, but can you talk about that process?
Sure. So the mail strategy for 2020 hasn't been finalized yet. I'll tell you what we're doing in 2018, and that kind of help frame the conversation. So in 2018, we had basically two different mail strategies for all of Providence County, a very small area of the country. But so the first was what we call internet choice. So we sent out a letter with the questionnaire in our first mailing, asking people to fill out the form, but also telling them, here's the website, survey.census.gov. Here's your unique identifier, which I'll talk about in a minute. If you want to, just go online and fill out your form. So that's the internet choice. So we'll be doing that. And then there's the internet push. And the internet push is we just send the letter. We don't include the questionnaire. We ask them to go online to fill it out. The second mail out was a postcard, just a reminder postcard, again, with the unique identifier and the website address, asking people to go out. It was the fourth mailing that we did, and when we started our targeted mailing. So first mailing was in mid-March. That second mailing came maybe 2 weeks later. The fourth mailing, which was about mid-April, every address in which we hadn't received a response yet, we sent a questionnaire to. All right, so the majority of the country will get a letter as their first. Now, on that letter also include the toll-free number that if they want to call and give their information over the phone, or if they want to request a paper form, we'll mail them one out. Yeah.
And so a key thing, just correct me if I'm wrong, is that everybody's going to get this unique indicator. You can't just walk in, you just can't just pull up the website and be like, oh, I'm going to do my form now. You have to have this number.
That's the cool thing about non-ID processing. So in looking at the chart on the wall, you see the first step of a census, and it's 4 easy steps. I tell people, don't try this at home. But establishing where to count people. That's just creating this giant address database so that we make sure when we mail out that letter, we're mailing it to everyone, to every place where someone lives or could live. And that unique identifier is tied to that. We need to know where people live so that when I get that response back and we release our data after 2020, we're releasing it in the right place. Because our goal is to count everyone once, only once, and in the right place. So that's what that identifier is for. Now, we have something this decade called non-ID processing. And basically what that means is you can go online, and please go to survey.census.gov so you can see it. You'll see where it says, please enter your code.
Yeah.
If you don't have that code, there's a button there that said, I don't have my code, but I still want to complete the survey. That's what non-ID processing does. So what it'll do is okay, well then tell us your address and tell us the nearest cross streets, all right? So that after we get your response, we're going to go to that file with all the addresses and try to match it, all right? That's all. Try to find what's the ID that's supposed to go with your particular response. So if it's as easy as 123 Main Street, and you know maybe you don't have your identifier with you, or you're at a baseball game or something, and you just decide to fill out your census form while you're there.
Baseball's boring.
Yeah. You have the ability then to go ahead and fill it out, and we'll match it behind the scenes. Now, how this is a game changer, in my opinion, when you think about those communities, two scenarios. First off, you think about those communities that are hard to count.
Right. And
maybe it's a church that is their trusted voice. Well, maybe after a Sunday church service, they're having a picnic, and the pastor or the preacher is talking about the importance of the census. and how community services that they all use are based upon the census count. Oh, by the way, we brought some laptops in.
Right.
We want everyone to fill out their form now. In the past, we used to have to say, go home, motivate people, fill out your form, go home and wait for it to show up in your mail.
So
Now
in
you
theory,
can
some
take-
of our grantee partners could do that at a
Absolutely.
community meeting, huh?
Absolutely. So that's you know, on a smaller scale. I had a meeting with the mayor of Boston, and he threw out the idea, how cool would it be, you know, April 1st is right around opening day. We're at Fenway Park, in the middle of an inning, you know, Big Poppy comes on the screen. Now, let's imagine this at Yankee Stadium or Citibank Field. But, you know, a celebrity, a trusted voice comes on the screen and says, hey, everyone, take out your smartphone now. Go to survey.census.gov and fill out your form.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So in New York, I know, and I'm sure in other places around the state, one of the issues is there may be an address with multiple occupants that are not necessarily, you know, maybe it's an illegal basement apartment or 3 families living in what looks like a one-family home. Will that help with those households being able to complete the census form even if they're not legally at that, do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, so we may not have their address on file.
Exactly, right.
It's not an
Or you
address
might not
that's been
right,
reported
right.
To us. So that's what the kind of the back end processing that we do. Whatever falls out, whatever we can't match, goes back to us in the field, and we do a field verification
Right, and
as
then you
part
see,
of non-response
these
follow-up.
mailboxes have 5 names on it.
Yep. Oh, yes, we do see that basement unit.
Yeah.
We didn't catch it during address canvassing, or it wasn't submitted via the local updated census addresses, or we didn't have something on it, or it's new.
Yeah, okay, that's
really my
great.
question.
Yeah, Steve?
Yeah,
What-
sure.
Where they are in the process.
So for the non-ID processing, so people open their smartphones at the Yankee game, and they start filling it out, and they realize, well, maybe I don't know, I need some information from home to actually finish filling it out. Can they stop and then go home and
Yeah,
finish filling it out?
it's a great question. It's a question I just got recently. Jeff and I had a good discussion earlier this week. I'm not sure. For some reason, I don't believe it does save it, especially with non-ID. So I think you would have to start over. And we're talking about name, address, or name. For non-ID, you'd have to put in your address, date of birth and age, gender, race and ethnicity, and your whether you're a homeowner or not, and your relationship to person 1 on the form. So that's all the information. So hopefully people don't get in that situation, but I certainly understand that could. And so I'm going to find out for sure and get back to you.
Well, and I think it depends probably whether it's a Mets or Yankee game, right? Because
Yeah.
at a Yankee game, you'd have, you know. Jeff?
Hold on a second. I just want to, so people can hear the questions on the thing.
You mentioned a 35% online response rate in Providence County. Any inkling or insight as to where those responses are coming from, whether it's just a general countywide number or the response rate in a hard-to-count census area? And by the way, maybe you should get a Red Sox Yankees Day April 1st.
That would be awesome.
Maybe you can just do it for us.
I don't. We're trying to find that out
Let me know
for
your
numerous
question.
reasons. Just curious to see, you know, is it concentrated in a certain area? We have a complete count committee, and that's something I want to talk about
Yeah,
at some point in
that
time.
question, yeah.
And it was created by the mayor of Providence. So they've been doing a lot, even though we don't have a robust partnership program. Our partners have been doing a lot. So we're trying to get that data at lower levels, but right now the only reports I've been receiving are at the county level, unfortunately.
So you mentioned complete count committee. And we talked about the partnership program, so I guess I know I'm especially curious to know the different, like, what is a complete count committee, and how do people get involved, and how many are there?
Yeah, and sometimes it gets so formalized that people get scared and just say, I don't want to be a part of this.
Right.
But basically, it's a group of individuals who have the knowledge and the passion of ensuring they get a complete and accurate count. So we tried, in the regions, we try to start this at the state level. And I can tell you, New York State, the Secretary of State's office, the Governor's office has been extremely engaging and on board with all this. And we're working towards putting a complete count committee for the state in
That would
place.
be statewide.
Yeah, in fact, they just, legislation for a complete count commission I think.
Well, the state budget included, provision for a complete count commission, but that's to study 2010 undercount, make recommendations.
Yeah, exactly.
That's not funded.
Only the part near
So what the complete count committees do, and again, we'll start at the state level, and to me, this is just my perception, the lower level geography complete count committees are more impactful. Where I see the state, higher level complete count committees, they ensure that communication is received throughout the state, and they help to identify resource issues or help pool issues. And my biggest concern with our partner, we have, funding issues. A lot of other agencies and organizations, private and government, have funding issues. So we really need to make sure that we aren't stepping on each other's toes, or we aren't both using large amounts of resources to do the same thing in the same area.
Yeah.
And that's where a complete count committee comes in. So at the highest level, we like someone to chair it who has the power to keep people engaged throughout the life cycle of the census, not just a one and done meeting. And then you bring people to the table that I guess covers particular areas. So maybe you have someone that covers the Hispanic community. You have someone who covers the faith-based communities within that geography. You have someone who covers the schools, colleges and universities, any race and ethnicity organizations, small businesses, civic leaders, things like that. And it's just getting them to a table, having everyone understand what the 2020 census is and what the process is, and then how can they help? How can they help? Two things I always ask partners. We need help in recruiting people, and we need help in pushing people to fill out their form online. And if they don't do it online, we still need them to fill it out, whether that's over the phone, whether that's on paper, or, come May of 2020 when we're knocking on doors, we need them to open up their doors and give us a few minutes to answer those 10 questions.
So is it accurate to say that a complete count committee is almost like a better way for the Census Bureau to organize its partnerships? Like, in other words, what you're describing sounds like what a lot of us are doing, right? Which are bringing different people together, talking about the importance of the census. Do we declare ourselves a complete count committee? Like, what's the difference? Like, between...
That's exactly it. We have... There's commissions and committees. The only difference is legislation, as far as a commission and a committee. But committees are, there's no formal process. You say, I want to start a complete count committee. These are the groups. And then what I commit to doing as the regional director is ensuring who are the other complete count committees within the state. Who are the other, if you have a complete count committee that's not based on geography, maybe it's just faith-based.
Could be, or identity. So
yeah.
If you're, because the community groups that we all support, some of them might belong to geographically based committees, but they also might have one that's just based on the kind of work they do. So both those things could be true.
Absolutely.
Right. Okay, cool. Other questions? Alta?
Jeff, thanks so much for being with us. A little earlier in the conversation, Maria had referenced one of the challenges for an online count as being broadband access, and I imagine another might be digital security. And just given the current conversation around Facebook, Cambridge Analytica, I imagine this exacerbates the apprehension and fear that you had referenced at the outset as well. I'm curious what steps you all are taking internally to build protocol to confront that, and also externally in the use of and partnership with community-based organizations, what kind of messaging you might rely on?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. So internet security is one of our top priorities, and a lot of the funding that we received recently, and even throughout the decade, everything is being pushed at these systems, the funding, and that's why you don't see big partnership things right now or the communication campaign, because we got to get the systems right and the security of our data right. And so I can tell you that is a top priority for the U.S. Census Bureau. The messaging that we like to give our partners is around Title 13.
Whole thing.
but they can be in prison for up to 5 years or fined up to
I do want to know
$250,000.
about this Title 13.
If we lose our confidentiality, that's the foundation of everything that we do. So if we breach that, we're in trouble. So that's one of the things we focus on. The other thing I like to focus on, I go back to a meeting I had with the mayor in Frisco, Texas for 2010, and we were, concerns were coming up about all this data, this personal data I'm giving you, and he said, of course, they had Blockbuster videos at that time. I don't know if anyone remembers those, but he said, you put more information on your Blockbuster video application than you do on the census form. And when you think about name, age and race and ethnicity, date of birth, I mean, we never ask for social security number, we never ask for bank account information, and let me just briefly off topic say there are a lot of scams that come around with 2020, and that's another thing that our partners are extremely helpful with. If they hear about something in their community or their community members, I got a form, it says census on the top, it asks 5 questions, and tells me to send my check with $10, back to this address, let us know.
Right.
And this is throughout the decade. We'll do all the legwork. There are some legitimate surveys that go on, both private and non-profit and governmental units, surveys that go on. But there's also a lot of scams, and we'll do all the work to tell you whether it's a scam or not. And that's one of the things we do with our complete count committees with our partners. We learn from them, hey, something's going on, is this legit? And at the same time, we'll tell you whether or not it is.
Yeah, that's great. I want to check to see if there are questions from our partners upstate, just because I don't want to forget the folks that are not in the room. Michael?
Yes, so thus far, we have them on mute so that we don't get voicemail, but they've been typing questions and I haven't gotten typed in questions. So
Okay.
if anybody who is listening wants to ask a question, please type in your question.
Great. So just a reminder to the people upstate, if you have questions, even if questions that you think of later on, just make sure you type them in. Michael is letting us know. Someone here?
Anybody have a question you want me to send?
Yeah, that's a great question. I just don't know yet. This campaign is that, again, national campaign is in its infancy. One of the great things we had last decade that I'm hopeful we're going to also have, it's in the plans for this decade, is a local media, where I had a budget to work with local media to get the message out. And that's, again, we'll work with our partners. So we'll see what is the issue for this particular community or this area, and, is it mistrust of government, or what is it? And then is it the privacy? Is it they're afraid their data is going to be compromised? And then work together with you or our partner on, okay, what's the right message? And then do we need to, purchase PSA spots? Do we need to purchase an article? Do we need to interview someone, in a newspaper kind of thing? Yeah.
Thanks. First of all, thank you for the presentation. This is really wonderful. But I'm wondering if you have someone, in a immigrant community, their link is on the smartphone. If they're not quite persuaded by, the Title 13 oath and public service announcements, and even if just 5% of the people in question are apprehensive to fill it out, it can have huge consequences.
Absolutely.
I'm just wondering if this is going to be enough to reach the people we want to reach.
Because we have limited amount of time, I want to get in some questions from upstate
okay.
too. So maybe you can answer things all at one time. So Jennifer Leonard from Rochester asked, can you discuss the impact of the citizenship question? And Lisa Fasolo-Frischman asked, if there is time, can Jeff give us an update on how LUCA efforts are going, and are there areas that need more support to complete LUCA?
Okay.
Those are good questions.
Yeah, great questions. Let me go in reverse order real quick on LUCA. LUCA is going very well from what I understand. We had the highest number of participants this time around than what we have in the past 2 census cycles, which is fantastic. So we're learning from our partners how well things are going. We're providing additional one-on-one support as needed. So no major hiccups regarding LUCA right now. Regarding the citizenship question, I can't really get into any details on that. That wasn't a decision made by the Bureau. you know, the Secretary of Commerce came out and said this was a decision that he made based upon the research that he did and the communications he had. So I like to focus on kind of the things within our control, and that's not within what's on the questionnaire is not within my control. What's in my control, and if you put this with the fear of government and kind of getting to the first question that was raised, this is where partnership, this is where all of you are so important, because again, the message isn't going to mean anything coming from me. I understand that. As passionate as I am about the census and wanting to count everyone, I know people aren't going to trust me, right? Just because I'm from the Census Bureau or I'm a federal employee. I look to our partners to help us with that 5% you talked about. We have to engage our partners to learn what is it that neighborhood or that individual housing unit or that individual person, what is it that will get them to understand why this is so important. You know, maybe it's talking about, did you know this bus line was added in the community because based upon census data? Or do you know we missed all these people back in 2010 and you look at our schools and they're overcrowded? We have to get it right, because if we don't, we got to wait another 10 years. Great question. Thank you.
Yeah, and another way I think that foundations can be helpful to you guys in terms of partnerships. And that, I had a question about when you were in Dallas or in other times you worked on the census, what was your relationship with foundations, and were they helpful partners, and how do you feel like we can, specifically to foundations, how can we be helpful going forward?
Absolutely. So my engagement in 2010 was more at the implementation level. I was the deputy regional director. The regional director handled all the direct contact and interaction, similar to how we're going to do it in the New York region for 2020. But we had things like throughout the life cycle of the census, and the things that I tried to recall that I could remember, try to forget things after 10 years. But like, for instance, we had an issue getting into a neighborhood in the Mississippi Delta area, and it was a funding organization that reached out to us to let us know the issue, to say, hey, I have some of the people, some of the organizations that serve the people who live in that particular apartment complex that won't open the door to this enumerator because it doesn't look like them. You know, they don't trust that person at the door, and they reached out to us. And then we worked together, and we moved some things around to get the right people there to enumerate.
Right.
So
well, that's
they're a great conduit into the community and the Census Bureau. That's where I see these organizations.
So really on that granular a level, foundations should think of themselves as being helpful in terms of, like, we know these groups are working in these areas. That's really great.
Yeah, and if you see something where you don't think there's enough census presence, or we need to hire a partnership specialist that has experience with this community or needs to speak this language. Right. That I mean, I see the foundations is really providing us with the information, with connecting us to the right people to ensure that we're going to get everyone counted.
That's great. We are actually out of time. We need to move on to Steve's presentation. I think Jeff is going to stay with us and may have some input as he begins to talk. I guess I, for one, just want to say I'm glad you didn't become an insurance actuary, because it's really clear that we're fortunate to have you assigned to our region and caring so much about these issues. So thank you.
Thank you.
I just want to add two questions that were added at the end, and maybe we'll cover them either through Steve or at follow-up at the end. So, question from Western New York: Can you is looking for updates on the address lists and whether they are where they're at in your process, and who's doing the work. Is UPS, the United States Postal Service, involved in that? And the other question is, what advice do you have for philanthropy in terms of funding for impact, specifically which types of orgs we should be funding to compel people to get engaged? So maybe that can come up towards the end of the discussion.
Okay, so as always, we have a lot of great questions. Thank you so much, Jeff and Maria. That was really very rich with information. And now we're going to, speaking of rich with information, we're going to shift now to Steve Romalewski, who's going to present a series of interactive maps that have been, I should give a shout out to the national funders, the Census Funders Group. that supported this work. And I know that some of you were at our previous session where Jerry Mannion from Carnegie Corporation, who's very involved with that organization, talked a lot about what the national funders are up to. And so this is an example. So I'm going to hand it over to Steve at this point.
Thanks very much, Pat and Maria. Great to be here. And how I was going to introduce this was to say that because I think of the various challenges that are maybe not new but more intense for this particular census, and because of all the changes in the census, coalition of philanthropic foundations at the national level. We're a little ahead of ourselves. Sorry. So a coalition of foundations at the national level have already started to provide grants and resources to organizations to provide data, research, tools, and information and strategies to organizations that provide those resources to organizations around the country who are beginning to think about, all right, how can we start to get involved? How can we start to plan our census campaigns? And so we're participating in that effort, and we've developed a nationwide interactive map that we'll talk about, and hopefully it's a very helpful tool to think about as you're developing outreach and educational strategies and working with grantees to do that, where to focus your efforts and maybe how to customize or prioritize the messages that you're sending out. And this is actually a reprise of an effort that we developed for the 2010 census. This time around, we're starting a little earlier, and so we have a little bit more time. And so we've rolled out an initial version of the map that I'll talk about today, and we'll be updating it and enhancing it further as it gets up closer to 2020 and then beyond. So I thought it was it would be helpful just to talk for a second in a little bit more detail about the enumeration process, because that will inform what you're going to see on the map. So, I mean, Jeff certainly talked about this, but just to emphasize a couple of points. So the enumeration process for the decennial census, whoops, why is this jumping ahead? Okay, I'm not touching it. All right, so the enumeration process proceeds in two phases. One is the self-response phase, where, as Jeff mentioned, every household in the country, virtually every household in the country gets a mailing. And as he talked about, that mailing either will have the questionnaire for some households, more likely will have a link where you can go online and fill out the questionnaire. And that's where, according to research and Census Bureau analysis, that's where the most accurate and comprehensive information comes in. And hopefully, that's where most households will participate and respond. There's also maybe a level of privacy protection in that effort, because you're submitting your information directly. Your household head is submitting the household's information directly to the Census Bureau, no middle person. The second phase is the non-response phase. And so if you don't self-respond, then, as Jeff pointed out, the Census Bureau hires literally hundreds of thousands of people to go household to household, door to door, person to person, after April to collect the information, because the Census Bureau is charged with counting everyone. And so that's a very expensive process, cost $2 billion in 2010. And that's where the risk is, according, again, to all the research that's been done, of where people might be missed. Information might not be collected accurately or comprehensively. There's also the privacy concern, because you're actually talking to someone, you're giving the information to a person as opposed to anonymously, or not anonymously, but sending it online without the intervention of someone else. That's not to say that the enumerators shouldn't be trusted, but there's, the concern is there. And so what we've done is we've looked at the past census, 2010 census, and based on information the Census Bureau has provided, identified areas where large shares of households, census tract by census tract, did not self-respond. And we're considering those areas, or we've termed those areas, and it's not just us, it's other consultants and people that have been involved in census analysis over the decades, the hard-to-count communities. So it's where a good chunk of households didn't participate, where the Census Bureau had to send a lot of enumerators to count a lot of households. And again, the concern is that that's where information gets missed and the count isn't as accurate as it needs to be. So what I wanted to go through is what this map looks like and how you can use this to enhance and prioritize your communication efforts, your grantee, your grant-making efforts and grantee efforts. So we've mapped the census tracts where basically they're in the worst 20% of, where they're in the worst 20% of the mail return rate, the share of households that mailed back their forms in 2020. So basically, if a census tract had fewer than 73% of its households mail back the form, we're considering those the hardest to count tracts in the country. So we've highlighted those in yellow to red on the map. And you can see that it's uneven. So there are some areas where a lot of households, most of the households in an area, participated in the self-response phase. But there are a lot of areas where most of the households did not. And actually, this is just a nationwide view. As you zoom in closer, which we will in a second, you'll see that that there's a lot of the areas that might not appear to have hard-to-count tracts on the map really do, because they're smaller and you can't see them at this level. So the first phase of the interactive map that we've developed was really intended to provide an easy way for groups to identify which congressional districts had large shares of hard-to-count communities, because of the need to really emphasize to Congress to fully fund the census. Oops. Sorry about the stuff jumping around. So the fiscal year 2018 budget has been approved, and the activists think that it's pretty adequate. The next fiscal year is still to be decided, but so we've started to begin to modify the map to make it more oriented towards outreach efforts and planning your education and outreach strategies. And I'll talk in a minute about how we're planning to update the map going forward. So when you zoom into the map, you can search very easily by state, by county, by address, by congressional district or state legislative district. And in this case, this shows a map that's zoomed into Congressional District 20 in the Albany and Schenectady area. And the information on the left side of the map provides overview of the district in terms of the hard-to-count population, not only the share of households that didn't mail back their forms in 2010, but also the current population based on the most current census estimates of people who live in those tracts to get a gauge of what we're dealing with now, and then contact information for the representative. And then you can also not only see, and I should say that information is also available, again, not just by congressional district, but by state, by county, and other areas. And we'll be adding other geographies to this, so cities, perhaps townships and the like, so you can use that information for whatever level of community you're focusing on. Then each of the 72,000 or so tracts in the country, we provide information as well on what the share of households mailed back their forms in 2010, but also more current information. So on the left-hand side, on the panel there, you can see, because the preferred option will be online, to submit your census questionnaire responses online, we show for that tract, based on the Federal Communications Commission, what share of households have adequate internet access. So you can get a sense of how that might factor in. And then also information on so-called populations at risk. So regardless of what happened in 2010, what the current population estimates are for groups that have tended to be undercounted, more so in the past than others. People of color, crowded households, renters, it's high correlation with households that don't self-respond, children under 5, people with limited English proficiency, and the like. So you can see the categories there. So the information, the tracts that are highlighted on the map are based on the 2010 participation, but we provide more recent information as well, so you can incorporate that into your strategies. So I just wanted to focus on a particular tract. This is zoomed into Utica, and this tract, go back for a second. there's about 5,000 people there, and it had a pretty low mail return rate in 2010. 61% or so of the households mailed back the form. The point I wanted to make is that, so this particular tract had a pretty high share of households that have adequate internet access, 80% or more, according to the Federal Communications Commission from 2016. We'll be updating that when the FCC provides more recent data. So you might think, you know, they have good internet access. People will fill out the form. Why worry about it? But when you look at the more recent population characteristics, so there's a large percentage of people of color living in the tract. You can see the statistics on the left-hand side. Most of the tracts are most of the households in the tract are renter households. And again, the Bureau considers renters, the share of renters in a household, to be the #1 predictor of low self-response, people not sending in their forms on their own. About a third of the households are headed by single parents, most of those with kids under 18. 40% of the tract or so are foreign-born, and most of those foreign-born residents have come to the country since 2000, so relatively recently. Three-quarters of the tract are either in poverty or close to it, have incomes in poverty or close to it, and 18% of the households have difficulty speaking English, and those households speak a mix of other languages, as you can see from the information on the map. So that presents a risk in terms of making sure that people have information, the census information, to know what to do, let alone fill out the form in a language they can understand. So a tract like this, which is not atypical, this is you know, somewhat common, especially in urban areas, but not just in urban areas. You've got busy single parents, they're recent immigrants, they have low incomes, they're in rented housing, and there are English language challenges. So it paints a picture of a tract that really needs to be counted fairly and accurately, but there's a lot of competing priorities that people who live there have that may not include filling out a census form at the top of the list, whether it's online or whether it's a printed form. So the map hopefully can provide you, again, with information, a mix of data sets and a mix of information strategies to use when you're planning your outreach, when you're working with grantees to think about where they should be focusing their efforts. Again, the map is nationwide. There's information for all the tracts in the country and all of the other geographies in the country. And we're also going to be adding information to the map where you'll be able to not only show the highlighted hard-to-count tracts, again, based on the 2010 mail return rates, but also to show the mapped patterns of where the populations at risk are. So you could use that to kind of triangulate where the areas are that you should concentrate in addition to having all of this information. When the 2020, oh, and I should point out, we've been talking with Jeff Weiss and others, and it was interesting to hear Jeff Baylor's point about libraries. We're going to try to add information to the map on locations of local resources like libraries, when you're looking at an area to focus on, you can get a sense of what places, what community facilities are that people can go to for help with the census form and the like. And then when the census results or the questionnaire responses start coming in April 2020, what we hope to do, which is what we did in 2010, is the Census Bureau was able, and hopefully they'll be able to do it again, in 2010 they provided weekly updates, tract by tract, community by community, state by state, on the level of participation, the share of households that were mailing back their forms. And so we were able to add that information to the map and also analyze it every week, so you could see almost in real time which areas were doing well and which areas weren't. So you can kind of redeploy resources, outreach resources, trusted partner resources, week to week, to make sure that people are to focus on the areas that hadn't mailed it in, and also to begin to communicate to communities where a lot of census enumerators were going to be going to know that the Census Bureau is going to be in your area, and to open the door and talk with them and give them your information. It's important to do. So that's it. I could go to an interactive, the map itself. I don't know if I need to. We don't want to push the technology limits too much. But maybe you could open up the questions, and then if need be, we can show the map itself.
All right, maybe we'll go to questions, and then a question might lead to an opportunity to actually demonstrate. So let's start with the folks in the room here. Any questions for Steve? Maria?
Steve, can you say just, from looking at the New York State map now, where are the areas of greatest, where there's a high percentage of hard-to-count people?
So the concentrations in New York, I would tend to say, are mainly in urban areas. So we saw Utica, Syracuse, certainly New York City, a number of concentrated areas on Long Island. Some surprises, like a big cluster of areas in Sullivan County and Rockland County have high concentrations of hard-to-count tracts, in the Hudson Valley area generally. Also, I should point out that there are some areas that in 2010 didn't even get a mailing. They just had people going door to door right from the start. Because
what was the reason?
So because those areas either were very rural or large seasonal populations, so the Long Island's East End fell into this category, Hamilton County, a couple of other tracts in upstate New York. And so we can't show that on the map because in terms of what the mail return rate was, what the share of households that mailed it back, because they didn't mail it. They just directly gave their information to an enumerator. But because of the process of counting, we're considering those hard-to-count tracts as well, and so we show those on the map slightly differently, but also provide detailed information for those areas. So I should point out, though, that even if an area on the map isn't highlighted in yellow to red, as the hardest-to-count tracts in the country or one of, virtually every tract had some households that did not mail back their forms, and likely that's going to be the case again. So it's not only in areas where there are the hardest to count communities. Every community, virtually every community, will have enumerators going household to household, door to door. The ones we've highlighted on the map are the worst in the country, but it's still, they're going to be everywhere. So that's important to think about in terms of communication and education efforts.
Okay, and I'm checking with Michael to see if there are any questions from upstate yet?
No,
Mike?
nothing.
Nothing yet? Okay. Yes. Hi.
Thanks for the information. Thank you. Since it's becoming really expensive to do some of this counting, how realistic is it to start exploiting some of the administrative data that maybe some government offices or even private firms have already gathered from a lot of these groups, and complement or maybe do a shadow count or like to use it in order to reach those high percentages?
That's a very good question, and I think, though, it probably makes more sense for Jeff to answer that, because the Census Bureau is very actively considering that, probably is including that in plans for 2020.
Yeah, so we do have approval to research right now, and that's exactly what we're doing. We will be, the plan is to use administrative records for a couple of purposes. First off, to help us determine vacant units. So, for instance, we get data from the Postal Service twice a year. If we have data that says this particular unit, this 101 Main Street, is not receiving mail because it's vacant, we only need to maybe send a person to knock on that door once. All right? Why spend the money of sending someone back there 6 times, trying to find a neighbor or a knowledgeable person to tell us it's vacant, if we have this administrative data that tells us it's vacant? Now, again, that doesn't mean if someone lives there that they can't fill out the form. They still have opportunities to fill out the form. The other thing we're using administrative data for is to help us, when you think of how, like, UPS delivers packages, they give a list to their driver. They say, go here, then go this spot next, this house. We're doing that for our enumerators this time around. So we're asking our enumerators, tell us what hours you can work for the next 5 days. And let's say I can only work from 12 to 3 for the next 5 days. It's going to use administrative data to determine what households have the highest probability that someone's going to be at home between the hours of 12 and 3. For instance, if we have data from the IRS that says that this household, both parents are working parents and they have 2 kids in school, I wouldn't want to send an enumerator to that house between 12 and 3. Maybe if I have a retired, so it's going to help us, it's not the end all, but it's going to help us try to make our employees more efficient. So they're basically going to get a list of cases in the morning. If they say they can work, they'll get a list of cases. They'll go work those cases for the day, and then those cases will come off their handheld device. Whereas before, they were tied to an address and would continue working it until they finally found someone at home.
Question from upstate.
Oh, sure.
Sorry. So I'm not sure that this falls into either of your expertise areas, but the questioner wants to know, is it possible to quantify the cost to New York State for people not being counted? Essentially, how much money are we leaving on the table by not having people counted? And trying to make a point, it's important to drive a complete count. And what is the cost per person for each uncounted person?
Mm-hmm. That's a real relevant question, given that I know the Census Bureau is under a lot of pressure to do more with less money this time around. So these kinds of financial considerations are significant.
If I may, I don't know, I'm pretty sure you can't calculate, or it wouldn't make sense to calculate how much we would or could lose per person, but, and there are a variety of reasons for that I can discuss, but through the funding efforts of the National Foundations, a researcher has at least calculated the amount of federal dollars that is dependent on census data. And that information is provided, and it's also provided on a state level and program by program. So you could see, I forget what the number is for New York, but it's in the tens of billions of dollars that depends on accurate census, or it depends on census data. If it's accurate, we probably won't get as much of that as we could, or as we should. And you can see what the number is program by program for New York and for other states. And actually, if I can go to the map, I can show you, everyone here and on the phone, a link where you could see that. But the people involved in that research, I think, have cautioned against trying to come up with a per person, a per capita number, only because the programs are different. They don't all get allocated evenly throughout the state, and so it might be erroneous to do that. But at least you can see what the overall number is, and certainly use that in your outreach communication strategies. That, you know, New York depends on a lot of money from the federal government that relies on census data. So if it's inaccurate, we're not going to get the money we deserve.
So before we go to the map, I was going to give Jeff a chance to respond to that question also, and then we can turn to the interactive map, maybe.
It's up there on
okay.
the screen. I'm not sure if folks on the other end are seeing it or not.
All right, we're working on the map, folks, but in the meantime.
Yeah, no, Stephen answered it perfectly. I've seen studies as well, and thank you for addressing that. We don't disseminate the money, we disseminate the data. So again, we talk about the $675 billion of federal funding every year, and there have been some organizations that have taken that information, as Stephen said, provided it by a state level. You will see people out there who take that state level and then divide it by the population to say, this is what it's going to be, you know, if we miss one person. But again, as Stephen pointed out, there's various reasons why we don't want to do that.
I understand something. Is this on? Yeah. We're going to try at the Rockefeller Institute to take the data that the George Washington University's program, I don't know if you've all seen that, but it takes the top 16 or 20 federal programs and shows for each state how much the state gets. We're going to try to extrapolate that down to the county level so you can at least see not the cost of not counting people, but at least how much the county relies on good census numbers for good federal data. Not to qualify anyone else's numbers, but someone threw out the number of $3,000 per person not counted as lost money. But we're going to look at what the real money is and how much is distributed at the county level and try to map it out, working with Steve.
All right. So I think we're still working on the interactive slide to show, but in the meantime, we'll take another question. Maria?
I have two minor questions. So one is, if an individual chooses not to answer one or more of the questions on the census, how is that response counted, and will an enumerator come to their home to get that last answer or two?
Yeah, so as of right now, we have accepted incomplete surveys before, and that's the plan for 2020. We're still gonna ask that they fill out every question. I mean, it's important.
Right, but
for
would
the
someone
data
come to
quality.
their home?
No, the
Okay.
plan right now is if someone skipped a question, we would not be coming to them.
And then the second part of that, how long will individuals be allowed to self-respond? I'm just thinking if we're funding libraries, for example, to help people fill out their forms, what period of time would libraries actually be doing that?
It will be probably at least through July into August, I would say the timeframe.
So April 1 to,
It's actually mid-March, it'll probably take on all the way through at least, I know for sure the end of July, probably sometime into August.
great, thank you.
So, Steve, you want to take it away with
Sure.
the interactive feature?
So I just wanted to point out two things. One is, at the map at the top here, we have a set of links, one of which is resources. And if you click on that, scroll down a bit, there's a link here for Counting for Dollars. And if you click there at that PDF, $600 billion annually, that'll open up a new window with information about some of the research that we've just been talking about. And then just a little further down, so the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights has collected and provided on their website a whole array of information about the importance of the census, what it might mean for constituencies, for demographic segments of the population that have been undercounted. They provide a set of fact sheets and tables for different population groups. So there's a lot of information here that shows the data nationwide, but also state by state, congressional district by congressional district, and for some of the top cities in the country. So there's a lot of background information here as well. And then I just want to quickly go back to the map and let's look at New York quick. So you could see the areas on Long Island and Hudson Valley and some of the cities upstate that are highlighted on the map, the census tracts that had the lowest mail return rates in 2010 rather, and also some of the counties where this so-called update enumerate areas were that didn't even get a chance to mail in, but are still considered hard to count. And I also just want to point out that for each state, you can click a link that opens up a PDF map of the state that you could use for printing and bringing to meetings. And we'll be updating this as well on a county-by-county basis, and perhaps also for other geographies with some data behind it. So the plan is for each county, you'll be able to get a county map that'll have all the tracts delineated on the map in PDF form, so you could print it out, and also an Excel spreadsheet with all of the latest data from the census estimates for the populations at risk, tract by tract for all the tracts within the county. So you'll be able to use that for your local outreach purposes. That's it.
All right. It's so interesting when you zoom into the state level, all of the hard-to-count pieces with the portions of a county sort of pop into view, whereas they don't really show up. They don't register on the national map.
Right. And, sir, when you let's do a search, we're just looking at
New Erie County, please.
and
If you get a chance, take a look at it.
when you zoom in even further,
But thank you for organizing.
Thank you.
I'm sure we'll continue the conversation.
and you click on a tract, then you really get to see the detail at the local level about what the impact is.
Okay. So we wanted to allow about 30 to 20 minutes for a conversation about next steps and the notion of a collaborative fund to support census-related work. But we've got time for another couple of questions if there are any, and either for Jeff or for Steve. Yes.
It'll be interesting to see if digital online aspect changes things. I'm just curious because I noticed that census workers collect until 6 p.m. and that the data, that's not coming back is in the urban areas. If there's a correlation between, people are just not home usually.
Yeah, so when we're out there talking about the data collection as far as knocking on doors, collecting information, we typically work until 9 o'clock. But we have some staff that work later, and we typically don't start till 9 a.m., but we'll have some staff that work early. We need to find people when they're at home.
Yeah.
And you're absolutely right. 6 o'clock, a lot of people aren't even getting home from work yet, and, you know, if they're commuting and things like that. So certainly, it all depends on the area. Yep.
All right, yes, over here in the back?
Hi. So with the, I guess, like the termination of a number of protected statuses for a number of nations, there will probably be an increase in undocumented immigrants that are still either living here after their status has ended and have chosen not to depart the country. What are the plans around collecting information for those folks? Because there is that very, like, livid fear that information will then impact their immigration presence in this country.
So I gather if folks upstate haven't heard that entire question, let me know and we'll try to rephrase a short version of it.
Okay.
Did everybody get that?
No.
Okay, all right.
So at the Census Bureau, we're required to count everyone living in the United States, regardless of their status. So that's, again, that's where partnership, that's where our partners become important. So what our goal would be, if we have a community of people who aren't citizens, who are afraid to fill out a census form, we're going to try and find out, using our partnerships, who is that person that they go to trust. Is it a church organization? Is it a local, food grocery store type thing? Is it a community center? Is it a YMCA? Try to find out, who they trust, who's that trusted voice, and then work with that partner to explain to them that the census is safe, that we can't release their information, the data can't be used for other purposes, that, it's easy to fill out, it's only these roughly 10 questions or so, and talk about why it's important. Maybe that community group receives federal funding, and it's based upon, again, the number of people that live within that particular community. So that's what we're going to focus on, but we're required to count everyone living in the United States.
All right. I understand we might have temporarily lost the chat box, but we're back. We're back up. All right. Michael, do you have any questions to share? All right. Okay. All right. So anything else for Jeff or Steve before we wrap up this part of the conversation and go into a discussion about next steps and the ongoing conversations of this group and see where that might go? Anything else? Oh, yes.
There were 2 questions I know that he raised at the end of that I'll try to address. An update, I think, on the address list.
Yeah.
So we basically, when you think of this address database that we're creating for 2020, we took our address list from 2010. We're getting updates throughout the decade from Administrative Records. Postal Service gives us 2 files every year on all the addresses they're delivering to. The current surveys I talked about, part of what they do is update our address list. We have the local update of census addresses, which is the only time we share data during the census. We basically, for those states and local geographies that have signed up, whether it's municipality, a township, they sign up, we swear them in, and we'll give them our address list for their particular geography. They have the opportunity to work on it for 120 days. Once they get the address list, they have 120 days to reply back to us with any additions or deletions, any updates to that address list. That's going on right now, and it's different based upon state and municipality. And then next fall, in August, or next summer, in August of 2019, we'll do our address canvassing operation. We're roughly going to do that probably about 30% of the nation, the areas in which we think there's change or we can't tell if the change has occurred. A lot of this is urban areas, high-rise buildings, areas that have been affected by natural disasters, hurricanes. Well, we're going to send people on foot, and they're actually going to go and walk blocks and update the address list from what they see on the ground to what they have. So that's the current status of the address list. And then there was another thing about funding for impact, and I wanted to mention one thing that we did recently, and this may roll into what you guys talk about after this, but we had a Census Solutions workshop in Providence, Rhode Island 2 weeks ago, and the census director came up. It was hosted by the Urban League of Rhode Island. We had church, faith-based organizations there. We had libraries, organizations there. We had small businesses, ethnic groups, race groups. And this workshop, and we can provide a toolkit. So if you're looking at something that could be done in the future, in the near future, things that can be done very soon, this workshop brought these people together, all these partners, and they were each given a challenge. And one challenge was children under the age of 5. That's an undercounted group. African-American males ages 18 to 24. That's an undercounted group. The digital divide that we're going to have for 2020, that was another group. So basically, they were all given a challenge. And through these ideation workshops, they were given tasks, 8 minutes to do this, 15 minutes to do that. By the end of the day, they came up with a solution or something they would like to implement based upon that challenge. And one of the coolest things, so there were 2 groups, 2 separate groups for each challenge, and for the 18 to 24-year-old African-American males, they both came up with a similar solution to put a census kiosk, to actually have a partner who procures a tablet or a laptop, put it in a barbershop. And they would waive the license fees for that barbershop for every month that they had a census kiosk in there. You know, and so at the end of this day, there's basically commitment forms or just, you know, what can that partner do moving forward? And it was a great idea. The last thing I want to mention, and if I have just 2 minutes?
Sure.
Data dissemination. So one of the coolest things that we did this decade is started a data dissemination program. So when you think about the census, we hire all this partnership staff, we make these great relationships, and then we send all these partnership staff home, and we just don't have the funding or the staff to keep the relationship going throughout the decade. So they created this data dissemination program, and they kept 36 partnership specialists on board. Their job is solely to teach people how to access our data, how to use our data for free. So we have partner organizations. This is another example of something that could be done. If you're interested, you bring partners together, and we have specific workshops that we can do. We can do them in person. We can do them via webinar. We have things like grant writing workshops. We don't teach people how to write a grant. We teach them how to access the very specific data they need in order to put that information in their grant. Majority of federal grants now require the use of American Community Survey data, ACS data, that's refreshed every year. So we teach people how to access that data. There's a lot of private organizations that take our data and they pretty it up and they sell it. We'd rather teach you how to do that yourselves. They do other things for small businesses. We have a small business app out there that will help you. Basically, at the end of it, it creates a business plan that you could print out and take to a bank if you're interested in trying to acquire funding for, you know, a small business. So it's another thing, again, that can be done now. Now's not the time to talk about necessarily, hey, you got to fill out your census form, because it's not time to fill out the form. But there are some other things, and with this data dissemination, I think if people see how the data is used, they'll be much more willing to give it when it's time to ask them to fill out their form. So thank you.
That is a really excellent point, and I think it's a perfect segue for us to talk as funders, as resource people, as just people, New Yorkers committed to a fair, accurate, reliable census in 2020, to talk a little bit more, to sort of advance and progress our conversation about what role we might be able to play to support it. And so I'm going to, bear with me a little bit, I'm going to read from notes here because I want to be sure I don't forget anything. But as many of you know, there have been a few conversations we've had, I've had, Maria's had, and our colleague, our partner in crime, Sol Maria Alfonso, who is actually in New Orleans this morning and could not be with us. She's my colleague at the Long Island Community Foundation. There's a core working group of the 3 of us that we've been joined by Lisa Fasolo-Frischman from Engage New York, and as well as Emily and Corinne from New York Funders Alliance. And we've talked to some foundations. It seems pretty clear from the conversations we've had that there is a lot of interest in some version of a coordinated statewide grant-making strategy for census-related work, including possibly contributing money into a collective fund. So that outreach is going to continue. There are some of the folks in this room who will get a call, I'm sure, from one of us. But we thought it was also time that we give a little bit more thought to what that might look like And so here's some of the basic questions that I'm going to throw out that would apply to any kind of undertaking like that. And at New York Community Trust, we've done many of these kinds of donor collaboratives. And so there's a certain kind of, thinking process that you have to go through that answers some basic questions. First one being, obviously, what's the fundraising goal? What's a realistic goal in target in terms of raising money? What are the criteria for participation? It could be financial criteria. It could also be including entities, whether foundations, government entities, corporations, that don't want to pool their money or can't pool their money for whatever reason, but want to coordinate their grant decisions with the fund. How would it be staffed? How are proposals solicited, and how are grant decisions made? What do we call it? And then, of course, given the challenges of the 2020 census and given the complexity of our state of New York, there are other questions that are very particular to this moment in time. What would be the grant-making priority for such a fund? Would it be community-based, hard-to-count communities? Would it be more research and creation of more tools, such as the interactive maps that Steve showed? Would it be statewide messaging? And then, of course, there's a much longer list of a lot of other possibilities that could involve the kind of census solution workshops that Jeff just mentioned. It could involve working with small business communities. It could be really thinking outside the box in terms of the typical grantees that we may work with, as well as those grantees. But there's a lot of possibilities there. What's the time frame? So the time frame could be 2 years. Census is finished, that's done, the fund closes down. It could be 3 years. It could be 4 years. As many people know, the census does directly feed into and lead into apportionment. And so there's a number of organizations that have an interest in advocacy around redistricting. And so that might lead to a longer time frame than just that would be considering the census. Given the size of New York State, we might want to also think about the option of creating regional clusters that operate independently under the umbrella of a pooled fund that has some statewide branding to it. We also need to think about how the fund might relate to or coordinate with elected officials, with the business community, with national funders. And we're very fortunate that my colleague Sol Marie is very active with the National Funders Group, who's already done an incredible amount of work and has raised some money and may in fact be a possible partner for us in leveraging some additional funds for the state. So I know too that Lisa at Engage New York has already done a little bit of research on other statewide census funds that have started to gel. There are a handful of them. There are a few of them. So we have some examples to start with. So I just wanted to close before, letting other folks share their thoughts or reflections on any of these questions or on this concept, this notion. We'd love to have other folks join in this conversation in a smaller group. We're looking for people who are representing institutions that might consider participating, regardless of what that participation might look like. And so we want to, sort of put that out there. And I also want to say that for me, and I think I can speak for my fellow members of the Census Funders Work Group, regardless of how the notion of a fund, a collaborative fund, proceeds, just this learning community and coming together, including funders, including nonprofits, including independent resource people, academic institutions, any and every entity that's interested in ensuring a fair and accurate census, we want to continue these conversations too. So that's a whole separate parallel track, regardless of whether the fund, how or if it evolves. And so I'll give Maria an opportunity to add on to, or No? All right. So, and Michelle, my colleague from New York Community Trust, who's also very involved, she's sort of at the core of managing a couple of existing funder collaboratives, and so would likely, I'll be drafting her in a big way to help as we try to pull this together. So opening it up now for any reactions to that notion, and as well as, you know, to the whole morning that we've thrown a lot of information at you, a lot of interesting ideas I know are floating in my head. I can't really articulate them very well yet, but so this is your time to sort of share and react and respond.
I think the lines are all unmuted, so I think people should be able to contribute just by voice through the webinar format. So I think
we shall see.
And people in this room, please speak into a mic.
So I'll start then by calling out Emily and Lisa, because I've mentioned you two by name, and I know that you know, you've been very involved in these conversations as well. So certainly chime in. Maybe we're not able to hear them by audio. You guys might still be on mute. Is that possible?
Unmute your lines.
This is Emily. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
All right, great. I think just kind of feedback from the conversations that I've had with folks, and I know we have a large group participating, so I encourage you all to chime in if you feel differently or more strongly. But I think the reactions or the reflections that I've had from folks was that they're interested in getting engaged, and there's certainly a spectrum of that engagement. And I think people are still at this point of trying to figure out the best way to do that. So it's going to look different for different organizations, and I think folks are interested in the ongoing learning, and over the next several months it'll probably turn into some more tangible initiatives. I'm just not sure what that will necessarily look like, and like I said, I encourage the folks on the phone to speak up if they have specific ways that they're hoping to get engaged or specific action items they're looking at taking on.
Okay, so maybe I will take the MC's prerogative to call out. Can we hear from Buffalo? Anybody? Is there a thoughts or reflections on any of this from the folks in Buffalo? Albany?
I do have a question from New Jersey, actually. There's Kiki Jameson from the Fund for New Jersey. I am curious if any of you have launched outreach to engage business networks such as chambers, ethnic business associations, and small business organizations.
That's a great strategy. The short answer is no, not yet. At least I can't speak for everybody, but I can say that we have informally reached out in that way. I had the opportunity actually just 2 days ago to be in Washington, D.C., and met with a couple of Congress representatives who have a particular interest in the census, and one of them was Adriano Espaillat, who represents Washington Heights, Inwood, parts of East Harlem, and actually a little piece of the Northwest Bronx, believe it or not. He is very interested in connecting with the Bodega Association there and feels that they can play a really important role in helping ensure that the count in those communities is an accurate one. So, and then of course, there's the business community that in New York City, of course, the New York City Partnership and ABNY, Association for a Better New York, both have been a part of the coalition effort that the New York Immigration Coalition is pulling together. So, yes, the business community is very important. We are going to be reaching out, small businesses, neighborhood businesses, to the corporate sector as well, because we all stand to gain from making this census work. Anybody else want to talk about anything in particular related to that strategy of reaching out to the business community? Yes, Abney actually was at the last session that we had, and they've been engaged. I've had conversations offline with Angela Pinksy at Abney, and she's very interested in being an ongoing resource for this.
They were actually supposed to be on the webinar today, although I don't see their name in the listing. There's some like unnamed people on the listing here, but I don't know.
I'm going to call out Lisa. Lisa, are you on the webinar format with us?
Yes, I'm here, Pat.
She was asking questions earlier.
Okay, we were going to ask her to share a little bit about what she's learned about what other statewide census initiatives are active and what they're doing. And she's already reached out to, I know, California, Michigan, I believe Massachusetts, Minnesota. And so, you know, we're New York. We got to get in the, we got to get in the running there. We can't let these other states get ahead of us. And so, Jeff?
Any incentive, the California legislature and governor are likely to appropriate $30 million additional money for census outreach this year alone, totaling $50 million in the last few years. I mentioned New York created a commission to look at 2010. An effort was made to find some funding, didn't get through the budget, but it's a wake-up call.
Yeah, I'm not aware of any allocation that's been done at the state level in Albany as of yet. I know there have been some conversations, and I think a couple of people have been given the charge, the responsibility to sort of be the point people. So we're reaching out to them and maybe might feature them at a future session, which leads me to also say that if people have thoughts on future sessions, other people that we should be inviting, reaching out to, other topics, other angles to this, multifaceted, multidimensional issue. We're sort of open to hear about that as well. Yes. Microphone.
But in regards to your,
Hold on, let's get you a microphone. All right.
In regards to your kind of like listing of some of the factors we would want to consider if we're doing a collaborative fund, I kind of wanted to, I think, kind of explore the concept of the time frame piece, because we talked about whether it should be a shorter term or a longer term. And I know we've been having this conversation with a number of other groups as well of whether or not because New York, as we've kind of alluded to, we're kind of late in the game around this conversation around census work. If we need to integrate the entire strategy around civic engagement to also then think about long term, so that then the collaborative fund continues to exist, and so it's not every 10 years we're kind of back to starting from scratch, to kind of still engage the funders that are in this space, so that we're not kind of, starting all over again.
That's a great point. I am all for that. It's, it's all about whether there's enough of an appetite, a critical mass there, and the resources. But as one of the hats I wear at the Trust is the Program Officer for Civic Affairs. And, well, let's just say we have a lot of work to do in terms of civic engagement and civic affairs in the country, in the state, and in the city. The city is, the voter turnout rate is disastrous. I mean, just absolutely disastrous. And the mayor's even announced a democracy initiative that he's hoping, at this point it's really focused on public schools and public education, but wherever it comes from, we need all the civic engagement support that we can get. So if there's no other questions or comments, I guess we'll follow up with you guys individually. If any of you want to reach out proactively, please feel free to reach out to Maria or me. I think the attendance list has our email addresses. If not, we're happy to share them. And I guess I'm going to speak for, I'm going to draft Emily and Lisa. They'll be happy to continue the conversations they're having with their members upstate as well. So any closing words from anybody? All right. I think that's a wrap then. Thank you so much, everyone.
Really good. Oh, well.
Oh, so much for technology.
Good chat. Good chat.
Well, thank you for coming anyway.
Yeah,
No,
yeah.
thank you for
Do we want to take 2 minutes just to talk about this?
Yes.